All right, let's get the awkward stuff out of the way first. Yes, I shaved. Yes, the beard will grow back. No, it's not permanent. Second, yes, I got a new hat because so many people were just giving me for the old hat being like ripped, torn. I've had that hat for years, and I've never swapped it out. I still have that hat and you're still gonna see that hat. But for now, look at that, you got a new hat. So one of the most requested things that you guys have asked me is how do I pull an engine out of a Subaru? So we're gonna go over that today. I'm gonna give you like the probably most detailed step-by-step entertaining video you've watched on doing this. So we have another 06 STi. It's another Hawkeye, and yet it's white also. Apparently the Mod Garage has things for white 2006 Subaru STIs. Don't know why. So this one totally works. Everything's fine on that one. No blown engine, runs, drives, everything's solid. This one's getting what, stage 1 block? Stage 1 block, I don't know his like end target numbers for everything. I know we're doing fuel system exhaust stuff and some other goodies on this one, but today I'm just gonna show you how to take the engine out. So this is relatively similar across all Subarus with some minor exceptions that I'll point out here and there when going through this. But let me show you where we're gonna start. So this is our starting point for this one. Everything is intact. I could start the car if I wanted to right now, but I'm not. I'm not going to. Now you do not need a lift for this. I've pulled plenty of engines without a lift. You guys have seen me do it before. The lift definitely does make it easier, but it'll also give me access to be able to show you guys bolts, hangers, all that kind of stuff. So starting out with this 2006 Subaru STi WRXs. This can be applied to FA20s also. It's a little bit different with FA20s, but for the most, the concept still is intact. So the first thing that I'm gonna be doing here is getting out the intake, getting out the battery, top mount intercooler is gonna come off, and then I'm gonna remove the alternator. I'm not gonna give you guys a step-by-step on how to pull out each component, but I will run through it. Intake comes out with a couple of bolts holding the heat or the box in. Then it's just an 8mm clamp right there, that comes out. Battery, both terminals, both 10mm for the hangers. Intercooler, there's an 8mm right down there that connects up to the turbo. There's also one on the throttle body, and then you've got the crossover pipe right there. So this car is gonna be getting an AOS, so there's gonna be some things that I don't end up reusing, which is totally fine. I'm totally cool with that. So we're gonna start out easy. Intake comes out, intercooler comes out, battery comes out, then I'm gonna take the alternator out. So with our intake, intercooler, and battery and alternator out of the car, now we can move forward a little bit. So I am gonna raise the car up here in a little bit and we're gonna get all the coolant and oil drained out of this thing. But before I do that, I want to get the intake manifold off. So I've discovered the new way of doing this, which makes life a lot easier. Actually, I am gonna have to drain the coolant because I need to get this guy out of there first. So actually, before we remove the intake manifold, let me get this thing up in the air so that way I can show you where to drain coolant from, where to drain the oil from. It's pretty self-explanatory, but while I'm down there, I might as well show you guys. And while I'm down there, I might as well disconnect the downpipe from the catback. Let me get it up in the air and I'll show you guys what we're gonna do next. Ladies and gentlemen, we are now under the car. So what I'm gonna do down here is you're gonna have to disconnect the downpipe right here from the catback. I don't know what catback you have or anything like that, but there's 2 bolts right there holding it on. We've got 1 downpipe support off the transmission right there. And then we also have to drain the oil. We got a fancy like Cusco oil drain plug right there. And then the radiator. So on the radiator, there's just like a small little wing nut that we got to loosen. And then that guy will come right off. And then while I'm down here, I think I'm gonna hit those downpipe bolts with some PB Blaster, let them soak and start to get them off. Just so that way, once we go back up top, we can start working the downpipe off. While I'm down here, I am gonna get the exhaust manifold off up here, just while the coolant is draining, just because personal preference, you don't have to remove the exhaust manifold if you don't want to, but my preference is just removing the exhaust manifold. Makes life a little bit easier. Now, if you don't have a turbo car or a turbo model, no worries. Typically, your exhaust manifold is just going to come straight off the engine and then just shoot straight back, so you don't have to worry about trying to get this downpipe or anything off. You just need to get the header to the catback off to be able to pull the engine out. So let me start getting all this. Let me get these fluids drained out of here, and then we can go back topside and start working on getting that intake manifold off. So starting from the rear of the car going forward, I have both of the downpipe to catback bolts out. I've got the exhaust hanger support out for the downpipe. I've also loosened both of the transmission mount nuts because when we go to pull the engine, we want a little bit of play with the transmission, so we'll have more than enough with that little play. You're gonna have to disconnect this one O2 sensor right here on the downpipe. It's gonna be pretty much in the exact same location for stock and aftermarket downpipes. It just unclips, you can let it dangle for the time being. Coming up here, I've already got both of the engine mount nuts out right behind that sway bar right there. They're two 14mm nuts. You can either pull those out now or you can do it later. I haven't touched any of the downpipe nuts going up to the turbo or any of the transmission to bell housing bolts quite yet. We are gonna do that. Now up here, I've got the exhaust manifold off of the car as well, just to free up some room. I've got the oil drained, I've got the oil filter off, I've got a small rag stuffed in there just to keep any from slipping out. I've got the lower radiator hose disconnected. I've got both of the fans disconnected up here, so that way when we bring the car back down, we can just hop up top, get the radiator out of the car. Now something I noticed is this is a manual transmission, it's an STi, but it has an automatic transmission radiator in here. So these ports are typically for a transmission cooler for an automatic, which I thought was a little weird that it's in this car, but you know, you never know. I also pulled off the thermostat housing up here for the coolant just to be able to get more of it to flow out. So that's about the extent of what I'm doing down here right now. Now we're gonna bring the car back down and start disassembling the engine a little bit more. So with the coolant and oil drained out of this, now we can start tackling some of this stuff up here. So first thing I'm gonna do is get this upper radiator hose out, both of these clamps, get that hose out of there. Undo both of the radiator transmission supports, get the radiator out of here. That's gonna free up a lot of room here. You do need to disconnect this line here and that line there going to the radiator. Next up, the coolant expansion tank up top is going to come out. Then we're gonna start getting the intake manifold off. To get the intake manifold off, you're gonna have to disconnect these fuel lines over here. Now, those are quick disconnect fuel lines. I have a company 23 tool. I'll link it down below. You don't have to have this tool. You can buy a generic off the shelf one from like AutoZone, O'Reilly's, but this tool just makes life incredibly easy. That bottom fitting right there is always one that's a pain to get off. Even with this tool, this top one can be too with that little bracket that's welded to it. It's not the end of the world. Once the intake manifold's off, I'm gonna get the AC compressor and the power steering pump out of the way. You do not need to take off the AC lines. Don't take those off. Same with power steering. You do not have to take those lines off. I will show you how to move them without having to disconnect the lines, because if you don't have to re-burp your power steering system and get someone to come out and recharge your AC, just don't do it. So radiator is going to come out, hose, upper expansion tank, intake manifold with the TGVs. I'll show you how to get all that off once I actually get it off the car, because it's fairly cluttered right now and there's no way I'm going to be able to show you. So once you get the intake manifold off with the TGVs, you should be left with this. Now let me show you on the intake manifold what you got to take off. Now if we're looking at the intake manifold as we would from the front of the car, throttle body is pointing away from us. What you're gonna have to do is there are 4 of those 12mm hex bolts. There's one right there behind the turbo inlet, there's 2 of them right there in the center of the TGV, and then there's one up here behind that harness that sits down there. Same thing on the other side. You got one right here, 2 in the middle, 1 in the back. After you've gotten those out, what you're gonna have to do is disconnect the turbo inlet from the turbo. So that is just one clamp right there. We're gonna be replacing this one because it has seen better days. As for the wiring harness, you're gonna have to disconnect this one blue plug from each side of the head. This is for your oil control valve. You got one more plug right here that is your cam position sensor. You have one on each side of the head as well. Both of these are gonna connect up to the body. Same thing on this side. You've got these 2 plugs right here that are gonna connect up to the body, and I'll show you where all these go on the actual engine. Make sure you disconnect both of the coil pack plugs on both sides, or else this thing's not going to come out. Once you've gotten those out, make sure you disconnect the fuel line so that way you can pull it out. You've got one coolant hose right there, and then you've got one right there on the bottom of the throttle body. This one snapped just because it is so old. And then lastly, you've got your cam position sensor and your coolant temp sensor, well, and you have your oil pressure sensor down there too. All of those will disconnect, and then this whole thing should just slide right out. It's a little bit of a pain. You got to fanoodle it just a hair, but it will come out, I promise. Now to show you where all of that is on the engine, here is your crank position sensor. Here's your oil pressure sensor. sensor, your coolant temp sensor, your cam position sensor on the driver's head, your cam position sensor on the passenger head, your oil control valve on the passenger head, and the oil control valve on the driver's head. So those are what you have to disconnect. You also have to disconnect the knock sensor. My bad, I totally spaced on that one. Knock sensor's right there. It's the brown plug. You got to disconnect that one. The PCV system can be a little bit tricky to pull off of there also, but you're going to have to disconnect that. So now that we've got all of that disconnected, the next couple things I'm going to be doing is getting this turbo out of here. So to get the turbo out, you saw we already got the exhaust manifold off. Next up is going to be getting the downpipe off. So you've got 5 14mm bolts going around the outside of the downpipe. Once I get the downpipe off, I'll show you guys what that actually looks like. So I'm going to get 4 of the bolts from up top, and then the last one I'm going to get from the bottom of the car. You can do 3 of them from the bottom and 2 up top if you want to. I just find it a little easier to get 4 of them because you've got 1 right here, 2 on the top, and then 1 on the side, and then 1 on the bottom down there. So let's start getting that turbo out of here, and then I think we're ready to start splitting the engine from the transmission. So with the downpipe out of the car, this is what you should see. So up there on the turbo, you can see there's those 3 holes up on top. There's 1 on the left, and then there's 1 on the bottom. It's a stud on the bottom, so it's pretty easy to get the bolt out on that one. So now we can get that turbo out. Just kidding. Before I go to pull the turbo out, I am gonna start getting some of these bell housing bolts out. So there's 2 on the starter. There's 1 nut behind the axle, and then there's a bolt behind the axle also. So once the engine's out, I can actually show you guys all the locations for all these. Some of them are a little bit of a pain to get to. It's not possible. Same thing on this side. I'm gonna get to as many of them as I can. They're all 14mm bolts that mount the transmission up to the engine. So let me start pulling some of those out, and then once I get those out, we'll hop back up there, get the turbo out. And then I think at that point, we're gonna be ready to start taking this engine out of here. Turbo's out of the car. So to get the turbo out, it's relatively easy. So you've got 1 coolant line down here that goes to the bottom of the turbo. After you've gotten that off, there's 1 oil feed line that goes to the top. This one is coolant from the turbo up to these coolant expansion tanks. So on the turbo to the up pipe, you've got 1 bolt right here, 1 bolt right here, and then 1/3 bolt right there. You take those 3 bolts off, you disconnect both coolant lines and the oil feed, turbo will come right out. So now we're working on getting the starter and the bell housing bolts off. Before I go and just start yeeting all of these out of here, I need to disconnect the pitch stop because the motor's not gonna come out with the pitch stop still attached right there. We also need to disconnect these 2 coolant lines that go to the heater core from the engine. So I'm gonna get both of these disconnected, the pitch stop undone, then I'm gonna get the 2 bolts that hold the starter in place out. There's going to be 1 power source on the starter that goes to the fuse box in the battery area if you follow the cable back over here. So we're gonna get that guy off. That should be a 12mm. There's also 1 little slip connector that just like pulls right off that you need to get off. And then there is a grounding point on the top bolt right there that goes to the starter. I've already got that one off. It's the same as all the other bell housing bolts. It's just a 14mm. Once we get the starter out, then we can get the slide pin out for the transmission to disengage the throwout bearing from the transmission. It's kind of necessary to get it out of there. So let's get this out, get that slide pin out, and then we can pull this engine. It's ready to come out. So this is an important part that I want to show you guys because a lot of people miss this whenever they go to pull these engines for the first time. After you get the starter out down here, do you see that silver socket right there? That is a 14mm hex key. You need to pull the plug out of there and then get the slide pin out. In order to get the slide pin out, the easiest way that I found to do it is use an intake manifold bolt. So if you do go to the extent of taking the intake manifold off the TGVs, that bolt right there will pull it out. Just thread it in. There's a small threaded portion, then you can pull the slide pin out. After I get the slide pin out, I'll show you guys what it looks like. Let me get that plug out. Let me get the slide pin out. Once the slide pin's out, we can pull up on the clutch fork to release it from the throwout bearing, and then this bad boy is ready to come out. A lot of people ask where I hoist these engines up from. Typically, if I have one of these 4-post I guess, lift things for the engine hoist. I'll do one off of the power steering pump right here, one off the AC bracket right behind the dipstick, the other one on the top of the back of the block, and then same with that one over there. If you only have a 2-post lift, I go from the back of the block over there where that one is, and then the AC point there, so that way I can get even like distribution of weight right there. I prefer the ones with 4, so that way I can evenly distribute the weight a little bit better, but this thing is now ready to come out. So both of our engine mounts are disconnected, all the bell housing bolts are out, and I'll show you where all the bell housing bolts are once the engine's actually out, because there's no way I'm gonna be able to show you in between the firewall and the engine. Starter's out, everything is good to go at this point, so now we just gotta be a little rough with it. So we gotta shake it around a little bit, get a pry bar in between where the engine and the transmission touch back there, start to get them to separate. If you haven't already done this, make sure you get this one slide pin out. If you don't get the slide pin out, it's not going to come out. Another thing that you need to do is come back here and just grab on the clutch fork right there and just lift it up off the throwout bearing to make sure it's free. Once it's free, it's ready to come out. So let's get this thing out of here. So we have the engine out. It's really not that hard to do, you guys. Follow like these basic steps and I guarantee you can do it. So now with the engine out, I can go ahead and I can get the clutch and flywheel off of this thing. The flywheel is going to be sent out to be resurfaced. The clutch is going to go in the trash because we have a new one. We can get this thing on an engine stand now and start tearing it down. Don't worry about this. This is aftermarket. That is not OEM, so you don't need to worry about that. So let's pull off this clutch. These are all 12mm bolts going around the clutch. If you plan on reusing the clutch, do these in a star pattern to take them off. If you're going to be getting a new clutch, you can go ahead and just take them off however you want. I'm just going to go in a star pattern anyways, just because it's good practice. And then I'm going to start tearing this engine down. I've shown you guys how to do that before, but first let's get this thing on an engine stand, and then I can go on my merry way of continuing to get this thing apart. On the back side of the engine, now I can actually show you where all the bell housing bolts are. So you've got one right here and one right here. Those are going to be 2 longer bolts for the starter. You've also got one right here opposing it, one right below it, right next to where the oil drain is for the turbo. Right down here below that, you've got another one. You've got 2 of these locating dowels on each side of the engine. On the bottom here, you've got 2 studs. Those studs are what help align the engine when you go to put it back in. So same thing on that side. You got a stud, bolt hole right there, bolt hole, dowel, which the dowel is actually missing on this one, which is kind of interesting. And then the other starter bolt hole right there. So that is how you pull an engine out of a Subaru. Like I said, this is pretty universal across all Subarus. Yes, you're probably going to find some differences here and there for how they come out, but for the most part, this should get you there. For any like EJ model turbo Subaru, it's pretty much going to be this exact same process. How did my face why did neither of you tell me my face was this dirty? Dude, every single time, I don't understand. Anyways, I hope this helps you guys pull engines out of your guys' cars if you guys need them. I know some of you guys were asking for this video for quite a while, so I figured why not? Now is better than ever. Now is better than later. Now is better than not doing it. So there you guys go. If you guys do have any questions, feel free to drop them down below in the comments. I'm sure there's a couple smaller things I missed here and there, but this should get you there most of the way. Remember, just take your time. If you need to organize bolts when you're pulling them all out, go ahead, organize them, set them aside in a little container. At this point, I kind of memorized where every bolt in this engine bay goes. So normally I just throw them all in like separate little piles and I just kind of know where they go. But anyways, if you guys like the video, you know what to do. Go ahead, hit that like button, turn it black, blue, green, yellow, purple, silver, cyan, red, purple, silver, I don't know. Whatever color it turns for you. And let's do a color of the day today. Color of the day is going to be white, because this Hawkeye we're working on is white. And if you're not already subscribed to the channel, hit your boy up one of these corners. No idea which one I will put it in quite yet. But with that, I will catch you guys in the next one. Peace out, homies.